Okay, welcome to a very special edition of the Downtown Den with my good friend and Downtown's political commentator, Jim Hancock. And not surprisingly, we've decided to focus on the findings of the report into Liverpool City Council, released yesterday, of course, announced by Robert Jenrick at the dispatch box in the Commons, supported by Steve Reid, the Labour Shadow Minister. A fairly damning report, whichever way you want to look at it. But Jim, I just wanted to get your initial thoughts, because clearly it is unprecedented for a city this size to have government commissioners coming in, however much involvement they're going to have. But just the fact that commissioners are coming in demonstrates, I think, how serious some of the issues that have been unearthed are.
Yeah, you're quite right. I mean, there's been interventions in Doncaster, Tower Hamlets, places like that, but this is a major city. And whilst some people have pointed to the fact that it's not commissioners running the whole city, that they have got defined responsibilities, the fact of the matter is that those commissioners will have to take an overview of things, working with the chief executive. So this is unparalleled. My overwhelming reaction, Frank, is one of deep sadness, because you and I, Downtown in Business, and a number of other organisations, you know, we've been so excited by the transformation of the city over the last decade or two, being able to say to the people who are only too waiting in the wings to criticise Liverpool that things have changed, you know, when we had the capital of culture, but much more fundamentally all the business changes that you're extremely familiar with and have helped with. That's not been dismantled, absolutely not been dismantled in any way, but for the time being, Liverpool's back in the headlines for all the wrong reasons, and that's to me, from an external point of view, the great damage. My other observation is that Tony Reeves, the chief executive, emerges quite interestingly from this business. I mean, in some circumstances, after a report like this, you'd think the chief executive might be the first one out the door. But clearly, Tony Reeves, since he's been in office, has struggled with this culture, with this disorganisation. And he's clearly, in some ways, he may not thank me for this, but he's going to be sort of like a partner with the government and the commissioners in sorting things out.
And it is, if we focus on the processes that were identified in the report as just not being robust enough, clearly, the local authority and therefore the citizens of Liverpool not getting best value. And so, you know, those are serious issues that do need to be addressed. We're not, of course, going to comment on the police investigation that's running parallel to this, but nonetheless, there are other politicians outside of the mayor's office who do have involvement and engagement with this decision-making process. I just wondered whether, like me, Jim, you felt that they need to be reflecting on their positions this morning, those members of the cabinet who have been party to those very processes that are being so criticised.
Well, if not party, then they've not been cognizant of it. They've not been doing their jobs. I mean, there is a debate to be had about the mayoral model and whether the cabinet and the scrutiny, whether there's an embedded weakness in that system of governance, and we'll see that discussed over the next 2 or 3 years, whether we should have an elected mayor, whether we should have a cabinet government, or whether we should go back to the old days. I think you'd probably call them the bad old days of the leader emerging from the Labour group and then running things with a committee structure. But nevertheless, you're absolutely right that the cabinet should have had a role in scrutinising this, and for it not all to come as a huge surprise. I mean, we both know that the rumours about all this have been running around the city for years. It's not as if it's come as a complete surprise. And the idea that some of this could not have been properly scrutinised, the elected mayor held more to account, and maybe when Tony Reeves came in, it wouldn't have been such a mess that he had to deal with. So we'll have to see whether those cabinet ministers do take those responsibilities on. The other thing that's embedded in this, and this is one of the difficulties I think we're going to have to see play out, is the culture. You know, what do councillors see as their role? The cabinet certainly's role is to scrutinise the mayor. That wasn't perhaps happening. Other councillors obviously had inappropriate relationships with officers. I mean, the officer-councillor relationship is extremely extremely complicated in some ways, but what should be absolutely clear is that officers should be free to make their recommendations free of undue influence by councillors, and that's been a problem. Not just in Liverpool, I have to say. This issue's cropped up in a lot of places, but the relationships between the cabinets and the mayor, the councillors and the officers, and that sort of culture has got to be cleared up.
Interesting point you make, Jim, about there needing to be a review of whether the mayoral position continues in the city. I mean, as you know, we were big campaigners for that position to be introduced and established in Liverpool. And we thought, a figurehead leading the city from the front, taking responsibility for those big strategic decisions was really a progressive step. We never really had the conversation in as genuine a way as we should have been able to after the regional and mayor was elected. I think it's always been challenging to have Steve Rotherham and Joe Anderson in situ. There's been confusion about the roles. At times there's been tension between the combined authority and the city council. Again, I don't think anybody can pretend that that's not been the case. And so, I think that the time is absolutely right now to have that review. And I just wondered actually whether Robert Jenrick yesterday could have gone a step further. He's announced that there's going to be a significant reduction in councillors in 2 years' time, something we've been calling for a decade now. All-out elections, again, something I welcome. But we've basically got all the main candidates running for mayor saying they want to scrap the post. And I would have thought it was an opportunity for the Secretary of State yesterday to save the good citizens of Liverpool £1 million, which is what the mayoral office will cost us over the next couple of years, and just scrap the election. But just on those wider points, the mayoral role, that relationship, as I say, with the city region mayor, and, although, as I say, we were a big advocate of the city mayor role being established in the first instance, I'm of the view now, it's been saying it for a while, we've got more mayors than cathedrals now in Liverpool. So it does need to be looked at, doesn't it?
Yes, what is not clear to me is whether the 2023 referendum on the very question that you've posed is still going to be going ahead. There's a fairly general remark in Robert Jenrick's report where he says that the councillors must not change electoral arrangements. Now, I think that chiefly relates to what you've been talking about the warding of the city and so on. But we'll have to wait and see whether the government want the 23 referendum to go ahead. And this, of course, is a very live issue at the moment. You've raised it in a couple of downtown dens recently with Tom Bloxham and with Steve Broomhead as to whether the government remains enthusiastic for elected mayors as they used to be. And in a sense, Liverpool will be a test of that as to whether that actually happens. Obviously, these are very wide-ranging constitutional changes. It's going to be very interesting. I mean, I fully support it all out, every 4 years. Everybody knows what's at stake. It's a chance to elect the council and also to slim the council down, which not only saves some money, but, the question is whether you need so many councillors, particularly with a mayoral model. We'll have to see how that actually turns out.
And I think, again, you will be looking to, if I can put this as diplomatically as possible, a better quality and calibre of council member. I think, again, we've seen some big personalities disappear from local politics over the past decade, and that's been coincided with the Labour Party being taken over by people who are more interested in Palestine than the peerhead. So there is a job, I think, to be done, both in terms of that councillor training. You've mentioned, did cabinet members realise the role was to scrutinise the work of the mayor, particularly given the fact that many of them were appointed by the mayor? And do councillors understand and appreciate the legal duties and regulations that they are responsible for? So a big body of work there, just in terms of that strategic input that the local authority itself can have, formal training, better understanding from council members in terms of what the role is. But then for the Labour Party, this has been done on its watch. And we know that there have been issues of anti-Semitism. In my opinion, and again, this is a personal view that I'm expressing now, we've lost some good MPs because of that culture of bullying, which apparently is seeped into the local authority as well. So some difficult challenges for Labour ahead, I think, Jim.
Some very difficult challenges. I mean, just on the general point of getting better councillors, and that's not a party political thing. That's people who have got the time to invest in it, and that is a challenge for younger people. We'd all like to see a younger, more diverse council, but this is a problem way beyond Liverpool. Is to how you get people in the prime of life with businesses to run, community activities to do, to actually give up the time to be on a council. And it's made a little bit more difficult, dare I say, by exactly this reputational damage that Liverpool has suffered now. You know, some people are going to be saying, I don't want to touch it with a barge pole. So there is an issue about how we get good councillors right across the board. But you're absolutely right also about Labour. This is going to be fascinating. And my mind, as I'm so long in the tooth, does drift back to the 1980s. And just to paint a picture for the vast majority of young business people who are watching this who won't remember the context, when Neil Kinnock turned on the militant tendency in Liverpool, he had a team of people, a couple of MPs, Peter Kilfoyle, who's still around, John Evans, and Jane Kennedy, and they moved in on militant and they excised them from the council, and they broadly had the support of the MPs. Now, without sort of going into too much detail, the context seems to me to be much more difficult now. The Liverpool MPs, generally speaking, seem to not be giving Keir Starmer full support. Let me put it as mildly as I can. The membership of the Labour Party in Liverpool, as far as I can see, is certainly not yet won over by the Starmer project. So into that mix, Steve Reid, who clearly supported this report, is going to move in and try and choose Labour candidates for the all-out election. That's what we'll be looking forward to, not the immediate one, who represent the Starmer project, if you like, which has a national. Whether you agree with it or not, it's clearly to make a Labour electable nationally, but that also needs to be the case locally. But I think that's a very uphill task if you haven't, if people are going to, I mean, I haven't heard anyone explicitly coming out with this yet, but you can just hear the rhetoric, you're supporting the Tory commissioners coming in, and they won't be Tories at all. They'll actually be professional civil servants. And you want the Tories to run this city. You could see that sort of dialogue opening up as the National Labour Party moves in. Very, very difficult situation. I don't know how it's going to turn out.
Yeah, there have been some of those comments from what I would describe as some of the usual suspects on social media. But like you, Jim, I'm aware of some of the characters that have undertaken similar roles across the country, and not necessarily as high profile, but certainly being asked to go and support, help, and get councils through difficulties. And they don't have party political agendas. That's not their role. Their role is simply to look at the efficient ways in which councils can improve and, as we said earlier, fix some of those processes that, whichever political view you have clearly gone badly wrong in Liverpool. So let me just broaden this debate slightly from beyond Liverpool, but I think this is one of the issues which has impacted on the city. And actually, it's been a problem in the city for potentially 20 years now. And it's this one-party state situation that we tend to get ourselves into. It's bizarre, really, because we had a Liberal Democrat council under the leadership of Mike Story, a real modernising team around him led by David Henshaw, a city that had gone through the doldrums, that started to revive, let's give credit where it's due, under that regime of Story and Henshaw. And then all of a sudden, the Liberal Democrats ended up with a huge majority on the city council, not really having to worry about the Labour Party or other opposition parties, then start internal conversations, fights, battles. Then we have a fallout with the chief executive of the leader, and the rest is history. We then have new Labour leader emerges. The Labour Party builds up this massive majority. Same problem, you know, again, not telling anybody anything they don't know. Big fallouts with deputy mayors. Anne O'Byrne and Joe Anderson fall out. Nick Small falls out with the mayor. Other people start to create internal difficulties within the Labour group. And so my question is, slimming the council down is a way in which you can help and assist with that problem, because obviously where you've got 3-member wards, for example, and it's, you know, stand a pig, stick Labour on and it wins, that's going to be one in future. So it's going to slim the majority potentially. But I think we're ripe for electoral reform of local government, Jim, because the exception that proves the rule for me is Manchester. You know, how Richard and Howard and now Joanne have held that together as a very, very good council over many years now. Does baffle me, but they've managed to do it. But elsewhere, I think the lack of opposition leads to, as I say, one-party states, poor scrutiny, poor opposition. And if I'm saying to you that I think cabinet members on the Labour side of Liverpool City Council should be looking at themselves in the mirror this morning, so too should the Liberal Democrats, because for me, they've taken their eye off the big picture. They're too much interested in gesture politics and having the odd kick at personalities rather than looking at the issues. And that failure of opposition has led us to where we are in Liverpool. And I think if you look at what's happened in Westminster for many years now because of poor opposition from Corbyn, if you look at what's happening in Scotland, whatever your views of Nicola Sturgeon, far too much power, in my opinion, in the hands of one party. It's dangerous for democracy, in my opinion, Jim. And I think the time for electoral reform is now.
Well, that's interesting. I'll put up a slight defence of Richard Kemp in the sense that he, you know, has been saying for some time that things were wrong in the city. But they definitely, when they were in office, were guilty after a few years of, you know, a dreadful breakdown between, you know, the leader and David Henshaw. In fact, we've got Lord Storey on a den in a few weeks' time, so maybe we can reflect on some of these issues. It's an interesting proposition of having electoral reform at local government level. Whether it would happen or not, I don't know, because the Conservatives are frightened to death of electoral reform. You know, it's 10 years now since the referendum, and everyone's forgotten now about a marginal change to voting. And would they think that if it was done at local level, well, what's good enough for local level? It just builds up a head of steam.
Well, we have it in the Scottish elections. We've got it for the mayoral elections, single transferable vote. There's different models that you can impose. I just think it's dangerous. As I say, you know, we're currently in this situation, and Labour Party members and friends of mine might be listening to this in horror, thinking, oh, we're just going to give a majority on a city council that we rule up for the sake of what? But actually, you know, as I've said, 10 years ago, it was the Liberal Democrats who were in this situation. So this isn't a party political point. This ought to be about, you know, a mature and, I think, more modern approach to local government and local democracy.
It is a striking feature, the strength of Labour on Merseyside. I mean, there's an awful lot of attention obviously paid in the general election to the collapse of the Labour wall in the north, but it didn't collapse in and around Merseyside. You know, I mean, you know, you and I remember the time when Sefton Council was hung, or in other parties' control. It's now solid Labour. I mean, all the local authorities are solid Labour, and all the constituencies are. So, I mean, and certainly the left in the Labour Party would actually point that, you know, we've got the right policies on Merseyside, you know, and this is why I think it's going to be quite difficult to change the culture. It's certainly, you know, a more balanced local authority, you know, would you know, maybe there'd still be a Labour majority, but what you're saying is there'd be a strong opposition, and you know, and you really want the Conservatives to be represented as well, but of course they're, you know, they're abysmally weak on Merseyside, and I think there's a certain cynicism amongst them as well, that they've sort of given up on Merseyside because they can win in general elections elsewhere, and it's not good for democracy. And whatever could be done about that, you make a valid point, and we'll see how open-minded Jenrick is to that.
We will see. And listen, we've been successful in one or two campaigns before. Perhaps Liverpool could be used as a pilot. to introduce something that was a bit different.
One other point I just wanted to make, this is a general one across the piece, is of course the coalition government abolished the Audit Commission, which used to keep a close eye on local government. And one wonders if that external body had been doing the regular auditing that local government used to be subjected to, whether this would have happened. And there are some people who believe that Liverpool will not be the last authority that faces this because of the absence of an effective national body overlooking local government.
Yeah, very interesting point. Listen, let's just finish then with Liverpool and where we are, because we've talked about the challenges, the issues. I was reflecting on the report last night, but also, of course, we're involved with many exciting initiatives and some great businesses in Liverpool. We've got fabulous things happening in the Knowledge Quarter, big investment there from L&G and Bruntwood. We have the Bramley Moor Dock development that will hopefully sooner rather than later get approval from government. And we've been given Freeport status recently by the Chancellor as well. Many other opportunities. So for me, James, glass is certainly still half full in Liverpool. I think this gives us a chance to reset the local authority. Tony Reeves has certainly got a very positive relationship with the business community here. And again, I think you were probably in the room when I interviewed Michael Heseltine in 2010. We asked him about the 80s, and arguably that was the start of Liverpool's renaissance. A big job, of course, but he told the story of rocking up in town and phoning the Chamber of Commerce to be met by an answer phone message. And he said, I'm still waiting for an answer. And the point he was making was that there was no private sector in Liverpool. The business community had abandoned the city. There was nowhere that he could go to actually start to develop those public-private sector relationships and partnerships to start that regeneration and development. And therefore, he had to go outside the boundaries of the city to do so. And what I've said to people for the past couple of weeks has been, as we've been awaiting this report and this comparison with the 1980s, which is almost inevitable, is that actually Liverpool in 2021 is a very, very different place to Liverpool of 1981. Much stronger, in a much better place, and most importantly, I think, big private sector players here who quite honestly have invested too much to just walk away.
Yes, well, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, Tony Reeves was pointing to a number of ongoing developments, the way in which the city dealt with the COVID crisis, the Paddington development, success in a number of bids for government funding. So that goes on. And providing, as I said right at the beginning of this, providing business can be confident that they're dealing with a council that will deal with planning applications and everything in an efficient, fair manner, then I don't think there's anything to worry about. There is an awful lot going on in the city that's absolutely fundamentally good, and the city is transformed from the early 1980s when the Albert Dock was full of sludge and the housing was dreadful and people were moving out, unemployment was increasing. It's unimaginably difficult, and I'm sure that everybody working together, the private sector working with Tony and hopefully the re-emergence of the Democratic Council, that things will be back on track.
Jim, good to speak to you and get your thoughts as always. I look forward to reading your blog later on in our bulletin, which I know is going to say a few more things about Liverpool, but great to see you, and I'll catch up with you soon.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed that video, then please subscribe to our YouTube channel on the link below and be among the first to get to listen to all the latest interviews through the Downtown Den.